So what I do as a regional wildlife manager, I oversee all wildlife operations in the 32 counties in the southwest part of the state. So habitat management is what we do. We acquire about 4,000 to 5,000 acres a year, mostly cropland, and our crew works hard on restoring those acres back to functional prairie systems. And if you open your map here, you can see our previous burn blocks. And we probably had 18 different burn units. That's not the important part I want to talk about. That's how many landowners we had out here when the project began. And now we're talking back going into the 60s and 70s. So you had 16 different landowners. They all had 16 different management styles. Some were grazing, some were haying, and that still replicates itself or expresses itself with the plant community you see out here today.
We've been working hand in hand for about 10 years doing this patch burn graze, and it's been a really good agreement with both of us, and it's worked out really good.
We do a modified patch burn graze out here. You know, when you think of patch burn graze, you're typically trying to remove all of the available forage. We basically want the cows to target our grasses. We want to save some of our forbs, so we stock it a little lighter. I think the first year it was done, they stocked it at 1.2 animal units per acre, and that was back in 2012. And the result of that was they hammered it. They took everything away, and people socially kind of got a little upset, like, oh, look at this, it doesn't look good out here. So then in 2013, they tried it at 1.6 animal units per acre. So when it gets stocked, we're basing our stocking rate off of the size of our burn patch. So everything else is just kind of lightly grazed, and that helps us create this kind of flowing mosaic of really short structured grass. Nearby you've got slightly longer than elsewhere. It hardly looks like it's been touched. So that leaves cover, varying heights of vegetation. And it's been a work in progress. So every year we're adjusting our stocking rate based on how the cows have been grazing and what it looks like just visually. So we went as light as 1.7 animal units per acre, and that was a little too light. We didn't really see get any grazing effect on the patch. So I think our balance is like right around 1.5, 1.6. And that seems to work pretty well with Ben, and I think all of our researchers out here, we try and keep them all happy because there's a lot of different people involved in this project. Going back a little bit, Dave started talking about fence and how we wanted to create this. No cross fencing. Everybody spent a bunch of time ripping out old fence. And we felt it looked like an eyesore to have fence just running all over the place. So we perimeter fenced it. We went and we used, as you can see, we used all green T-posts. So when you're driving down the roads, it doesn't even really look like there's a fence out here. So there's that kind of visual aspect to it as well. This year, like Walt said, we burned a larger patch. I think we included 3 units this year. Whereas when we first started it, after we completed one cycle, so burning 5 units, we said that was a cycle, and we sat back and we looked and we said, what happens if we go bigger? So no longer do we really burn 1 unit. We tried burning 2 units or 3 units. And because this was a tough spring for us to, one, get out here and get everything up and running, and to save time and trying to work with Ben to figure out how many cows we're going to put out here, we just kind of said, whatever we've usually been putting out. So this year is an oddball year in terms of grazing and burning.
In Minnesota, most of our prairies are managed by fire. You go with Ben in South Dakota, just a few miles that way, and it's all cattle. We're working with these guys all the time, and it's like, then all of a sudden this patch burn graze, it's really Pyrrhic hybridy, fancy, fire, basically cattle fire, grazing driven by fire. Wow, what a concept. Bison herds, elk herds, fire. And we wanted to get the structural heterogeneity back on this prairie. Yeah, it's wonderful. You would burn it and you get this tall structure. That's all we had. medium and tall. We didn't have the short. What about all the birds that need the short grass? So that's where we started getting into this, growing heterogeneity and then diversity. And were people nervous? I was nervous. Fred was nervous. Robert Dana was nervous. We're bringing out cattle to one of the best.
Cattle grazing as a management tool is relatively new to Minnesota. It's been, as Dave mentioned, it's been done a lot in the Dakotas, but it didn't really start getting promoted or used in Minnesota until around the mid-aughts, 2005, 2009. And there were a lot of questions about what, and so the reason that cattle grazing is important as a management tool is the structural alteration that Dave mentioned to try to create short grass, shorter habitat that benefits certain wildlife like meadowlarks, upland sandpipers. The other motivation was to have another tool to control invasive species, and another motivation was grass banking, which Walt mentioned, where producers rest their pasture in exchange for grazing on state land. But there are a lot of questions about what is going to be the effect of grazing management in our prairies in Minnesota. And a lot of the literature that comes that is about stuff like patch burn grazing comes from hotter and drier places like Kansas and Oklahoma. And the question is, how does that work in Minnesota, which is a cooler, moister environment than those places? In addition to that, a lot of the literature doesn't at all examine the effects on invasive or non-native species versus native species. And a bunch of ecologists and botanists here had a lot of questions about that. So we got started on setting up a program to monitor the grazing component of management at sites like this. We have several places in the state where we're trying to get at what's the contribution of the grazing component. In order to do that, we set up a monitoring design where we have paired plots, one of which is in an exclosure like this, and one of which is nearby but open to grazing, so that we could compare grazed versus ungrazed. We got these plots established and set up before any of the recent grazing started out here. So that was in 2011, and the patch burn grazing started in 2012. We sampled it, I think, about 4 times now so far. And what we're finding in this particular project is that we're not finding a significant difference in the diversity of native species between the grazed and the ungrazed, which is actually an encouraging outcome for a lot of ecologists who are worried about what this is grazing going to do. It's not altering the native vegetation. We're not finding a difference in the diversity of non-native species between the exclosures and the grazed plots. But what we are seeing is a steady increase in the abundance of non-native species in both. And the main driver of that is smooth brome grass, which you see a lot of out here.
I think there's a lot we don't know about recoupling fire and grazing interactions. So that's where, again, and I know we're not going to go back to the 1800s, right? But we had bison herds in Minnesota. We had elk herds in Minnesota. So these prairies did evolve with a certain amount of grazing. So I think tying that interaction together, now my memory bank's going off more, Walt can jump in. People tell me cows aren't browsers. They don't help on woody cover control. I would beg to differ. When you do a patch burn graze, everything is lush. Even those, what I'll call invasive trees that are poking through, and the cattle are going in there and grazing them. They're pushing into the patch, the plum thickets. They're opening that up. So I think you have some woody cover control by having grazing animals back on this landscape.